Of all the ships damaged at Pearl Harbor, the title of Most Extreme Rebuild has to go to the topic of today's video, USS Cassin and USS Downs. Not because they came out as a radically different ship, like West Virginia, but because they came out as, for all intents and purposes, new ships built around the intact bits of the old ones. An argument can certainly be made that such a radical rebuild was a waste of resources. On the other hand, I almost made the title Flexing on Imperial Japan for a reason. At any rate, I am covering both sister ships in a double feature video. Because, other than limited pre-war service and a short wartime career, their stories are forever tied together. And, frankly speaking, a video on either ship alone would have been a short video indeed. The first bit will cover their pre-war career, such as it is. Then I'll cover Pearl Harbor and the aftermath, and then finally, their post-refit service, which was also pretty limited. That disclaimer done, let's get into it. To start, a quick Cliff Notes version of the technical specs. Cassin and Downs, as sister ships, are both members of the Mahan-class destroyer. As built, they were intended to displace around 1,500 tons, though this would vary from ship to ship. On that displacement, the destroyers carried 5 of the then new 5-inch 38 caliber gun, and dual-purpose mounts, making this class one of the first American destroyers capable of using their main battery in that manner. In addition to the guns, the ships also carried 12 21-inch torpedo tubes and 3 quadruple mounts, one on either broadside and the third on the center line between the two funnels. To round out the initial loadout, the destroyers carried 2 depth charge racks and a handful of machine guns, all of which mounted on a hull that could manage around 37 knots on 46,000 shaft horsepower. This weapon fit would change later in their career, but for now let's move to the pre-war service. I will cover both destroyers here, though there is not much of note in either case. The first I'll look at is USS Cassin. She was laid down on October 1st, 1934, and launched a little over a year later on October 28th, 1935. Commissioned into the fleet on August 21st, 1936, she entered into the traditional sea trial and working up phase. This would be fairly uneventful for the destroyer, with the exception of an incident in August 1937. Specifically on August 18th. On that day, Cassin was in dry dock when a steam line ruptured. While this was under control in short order, 4 men still died in her engine room. Another 10 were burnt and scalded by the steam. Not the most auspicious start to a career, but also not the worst thing to happen in a dry dock. Regardless, Cassin was soon off to join the Pacific Fleet. In April of 1938, she arrived in Pearl Harbor for fleet exercises. Following that, she was assigned to the West Coast for further training duty, lasting through the start of 1940. In April of 1940, 2 years after arriving in the Pacific, Cassin was assigned to Hawaii. This assignment saw her continue her fleet training, in addition to port visits. The port visits between February and April 1941 saw her range as far as Samoa and Australia. Cassin would, however, return to Hawaii, and it was there she would find herself on December 7th, helpless in dry dock. Before that, though, I'll take a quick look at Downs. In her case, USS Downs was laid down on August 15, 1934, and launched on April 22, 1936. Her own commissioning would follow on January 15, 1937. So, while she was laid down first, everything else lagged behind Cassin. That aside, her initial career was, if anything, even less exciting. Downs spent a few months in the Atlantic for the usual workup process, then relocated to the Pacific by late 1937, November specifically. After that, Downs participated in fleet exercises and training on the West Coast, much like her sister. They probably operated together at least a few times during that process. And again, like her sister, Downs was assigned to Pearl Harbor in April 1940. She also joined Cassin on the port visits across the Pacific in mid-1941. You'll note that Cassin and Downs have pretty similar careers to this point. That isn't a surprise, as destroyers of the same class often operated together. It should also not be a surprise that, because of this, Downes was in dry dock at the same time as Cassin and Shaw. This was a scheduled refit for Mahan-class destroyers, intended to change up some features. Notably a simpler and lighter pole mast, and heavier hull plating towards the bow. Because of this, the three destroyers were all left high and dry on December 7th. Shaw's story I have already told. As for Cassin and Downes, well, they don't have the same famous explosion picture. But they do have famous pictures all their own, for reasons that will quickly become apparent as I get into it. First off, on that December morning, Cassin and Downes were resting in dry dock right beside each other. Both destroyers were ahead of the battleship Pennsylvania, all three ships undergoing work in the same dry dock. In the case of the destroyers, they were seeing pretty extensive modifications, as mentioned before, to their bow plating and masts. This saw their propellers and shafts pulled, and parts of the hull open on the bow. Furthermore, their guns were being overhauled, which meant the destroyers couldn't operate their main battery at all. As could be expected, most of their crews were ashore, as they weren't needed for the dock work. As a result, when the Japanese bombs and torpedoes started falling on December 7th, Cassin and Downes were basically helpless. Even so, the crew aboard the destroyers were quick to leap into action. The machine guns were still functional, unlike the 5-inch guns, so those were prompt in opening fire. Members of the crew were equally fast on rushing ashore, scouring repair shops for the breech blocks of the main battery. It is telling that, in spite of the gun being disabled, Downes' crew was still able to get off 2 shots from her number 3 gun. Somehow, her crew had managed to track the breech block down, get it back aboard, and get it fitted. And do it in time to do both a test shot to make sure it wouldn't knock the ship off her blocks, along with another shot at the Japanese. However, those shots would be the only shells that either destroyer got off from their main battery. By 8:50, Japanese dive bombers were attacking the destroyers. Each destroyer was hit at least once, with the action reports indicating anywhere between 2 or 3 times. Regardless, the hits to the destroyers, and the dry dock beneath them, began to set massive fires. Fuel tanks and fuel lines were perforated by explosions, setting off a raging inferno. This was bad enough, but, much like Shaw, the ship still had ammunition aboard in addition to fuel. That had allowed them to fight back, but it also began to cause even more damage as the fires reached magazines. There's a reason that ships are defueled and their magazines emptied in the modern day. That being said, things can always get worse. Because, as if the detonating 5-inch shells weren't enough of an issue, Downes suffered a particularly violent explosion. This was, as it turned out, her number 3 torpedo mount. This explosion caused severe damage to the destroyer, and flung fragments of the mounts onto the bow of Pennsylvania. The damage could easily have been even worse had the other tubes suffered similar explosions. However, according to the action report, the warheads in mounts 1 and 2 were found melted off in the aftermath of the attack. Just imagine how hot the fire must have been to do that. With all this bomb damage and the raging fires, the ships were doomed. By 9:20 that morning, both Cassin and Downes were abandoned. With Pennsylvania at risk from the fire spreading, the dry dock was flooded in an effort to combat that. Considering the raging fire, no one was really concerned about the destroyers being swamped by the water. As it was, Downes flooded rapidly because of damage beneath the waterline. This did, however, serve to keep her mostly upright on her blocks in the dock. Cassin was not so fortunate. In flooding more slowly, she ended up floating by her stern, while her bow remained on the blocks. It was at this point that things got a bit problematic, as if they weren't already. The rising water was doing little to actually put the fire out, as the oil blaze continued merrily along. This meant that, with the water level rising ever higher, it was bringing the fire towards more explosive bits, specifically the depth charges on Downes. As the destroyer had already suffered a torpedo detonation, there was a scramble to avoid an even worse explosion. The flooding was reversed and would, over the course of the morning, be alternated between filling and emptying the dock. This kept the fire from spreading to the depth charges, But it caused another issue. Namely, it caused Cassin to lose whatever stability she had left. The destroyer fell off her blocks and slumped against Downs. With her hull weakened by both fire and explosion damage, it buckled badly. Downs was not able to escape damage of her own, as a timber jammed itself beneath her bow, damaging that as the destroyer settled back down. As a result of this, you have the famous pictures of the burnt-out destroyers resting against each other. These pictures demonstrated the damage, but also hid the worst of it. When the dock was drained properly on December 8th, it revealed the true extent of the damage. Cassin, laying on her side, was a mess. She was buckled and twisted, with her plates burnt and her bridge smashed against her sister. Cassin was clearly a write-off, just based on that alone. Her sister was not any better. Downs may have been upright, but she had suffered more explosion damage, both from direct bomb hits and from her torpedoes, which had blown a sizable hole in her deck. A deck that was melted by the intense heat of the inferno she had been subjected to. Both ships were, for all intents and purposes, destroyed. Their hulls were burnt out, and in Cassin's case, twisted to near breaking point. It would have been incredibly expensive to try to repair the damage, and arguably impossible, between the heat damage and the twisting of their hulls. The ships were wrinkled from the fire, and I don't even want to think about what that meant for their structural integrity. When Oklahoma was considered more salvageable, you know how bad the situation is. While their sister Shaw was fitted with a temporary bow and sailed off under her own power for repairs, Cassin and Downs seemed to be write-offs. Their guns were stripped off and placed on other ships or shore batteries, while the Navy decided what to do with their hulks. Not that they could do much, really. Downs was at the point where 75% of her hull was damaged to the point of uselessness. Cassin, in spite of her crumpled appearance, apparently had about 60% of her hull in a salvageable state. However, that is misleading, as it doesn't mean that 60% could be worked into a timely or economic rebuild. It was likely simpler and cheaper to scrap the ships and reclaim what little worth they had left. Which is where things get interesting. While the hulls were wrecked to the point of not being worth repairing, the destroyers were remarkably intact on their interiors. Almost all of Cassin's machinery, electrical equipment, and weaponry was intact. Downs was only slightly worse off, with 90% of her machinery and a third of her electrical equipment in a salvageable state. She had lost a boiler due to the torpedo explosion, but the remainder of her power plant was still usable. This is where we enter the salvage operations. This turned out to be a lengthy process in the case of Cassin and Downs. It had to be started and stopped repeatedly, as other ships required the use of the dry dock. Each time, the shattered hulks were flooded once more. That their machinery remained intact throughout this entire process is almost as much a miracle as it surviving the initial attack. That said, by February of 1942, they were patched up enough to be refloated and pulled out of dock. At which point, more arguments began. Namely on what exactly to do with the hulks, now that they were technically able to float on their own merit. From the perspective of the Pacific Fleet, the ships were a waste of effort that could be better spent getting other ships into combat. Higher up the chain, however, the intact machinery was seen as incredibly valuable, mostly by virtue of the need for as many escort ships as possible. Anti-submarine operations were the name of the game, and destroyers were valuable things to have. However, there was no way to get around the damage. Intact machinery or not, floating hulls or not, Cassin and Downs weren't going to return to service as they were. The damage was just too severe. With that in mind, there were only a couple options. The simplest option being to just strip the hulks and use them as spare part depots for active warships. However, this was a somewhat wasteful option. High-pressure steam turbines don't exactly grow on trees. With Cassin and Downs having more or less intact, and still fairly new power plants, these were more useful in one piece. This left the Navy with the options of either putting the power plants in new ships, or trying to rebuild the hulks. As it would have been a massive headache to try and stuff the turbines and boilers in a different ship, that option was discarded. That just left the option of rebuilding the ships. When taking into account the morale boost this entailed, it isn't surprising. With that option decided upon by May 1942, it now became a matter of getting the machinery where it needed to be. It became apparent that the existing hulls were not going to make it to the West Coast under their own power. Even repairing them enough for towing was an issue, especially with a lack of escorts to protect them on their way back. Most of their machinery had already been stripped out in any case to better preserve it. As such, the Navy decided to scrap the old hulls and build brand new ships around the old machinery. As close to a modern ship of Theseus as you can get. Though, that being said, the new hulls were not copies of the originals. Leaving aside all of the issues of building an outdated design that was long out of production, there was another problem. Every shipyard builds each ship slightly differently. Mare Island, the yard instructed to rebuild Cassin and Downs, had built 2 Mahan-class destroyers. However, USS Smith and USS Preston had been slightly different to their sisters. To save time and energy, Cassin and Downs were rebuilt according to their plans. So even at the most basic level, they were not copies of the original ships. On top of that, a half-decade worth of design improvements were worked in. One of the 5-inch guns was removed, replaced by a much-improved anti-aircraft battery, 2 twin 40mm Bofors mounts, and 6 20mm cannon. Furthermore, one of the quad torpedo tubes was removed, with the remaining 2 mounted on the center line. The changes didn't end with weaponry either. A new bridge, more in line with contemporary destroyers, was installed. This was accompanied by a combat information center, new radars, and new sonar. To power all of that, the destroyers had more powerful turbo generators. They were also the only Mahan-class destroyers fitted with a Mark 37 fire control director. Frankly speaking, the new Cassin and Downs can almost be considered their own class, a curious mix of old and new features. That being said, they were pushing up on the limit of what their hulls could do. There wasn't the room for growth that more modern destroyers like the Fletchers had. This will become apparent later on. For now, though, their fate was decided. With the old ships scrapped, the intact equipment was shipped off to Mare Island to join the new hulls. The new USS Cassin, retaining her number of DD-372, was laid down on November 20th, 1942. The new USS Downs, DD-375, had her keel laid on October 13th. In both cases, numerous delays would follow. These ranged from the expected material shortages to issues replacing parts produced in the mid-1930s. The result of these delays saw Downs launching on May 20th, 1943, and Cassin on June 21st. In both cases, with little pomp or circumstance. Unfortunately, at this point, the ships were arguably surplus to requirements. The desperate need for destroyers had come and gone. It's something of a meme, actually, that the Navy had to tell Congress, please stop ordering destroyers, we can't crew them all. While the rebuilt destroyers were completely new, machinery aside, they were still fundamentally several classes, and coming up on a decade, out of date. In combination with the war in the Pacific winding down, the result is obvious. Cassin and Downs rejoined the fleet on February 5th, 1944, and November 15th, 1943, respectively. By this point, the war had long since passed them by. With the obvious exception of Leyte Gulf, the grand surface battles were over. It's not to say they didn't do anything, but they had missed the meat grinder of the Solomons, for example. That said, to look at the ships in order, let's start with Cassin. After returning to service, Cassin spent 1944 and 1945 on alternating duty. She would perform shore bombardment missions, from the Marshalls to the Marianas to Iwo Jima. And when she wasn't doing that, the destroyer would serve on escort duty with the fast carriers. This was almost non-stop action, and would result in her getting 6 battle stars for her service. However, it was also fairly uneventful service, with little to really talk about in detail. The most exciting things to happen are, arguably, enduring Typhoon Connie in June 1945, and then, in August of the same year, boarding a Japanese hospital ship to make sure it was following international law. Downes would end up having a similarly quiet career. Much like Cassin, this consisted mostly of shore bombardment and escort duty. The bombardment missions were in the Marianas, as well as Marcus Island. Her escort duties would take her up and down the Central Pacific, including escorting carriers during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Her main differences with Cassin come from two things. First, a stint as a harbor control vessel at Eniwetok in May 1944. Then, in late 1944, she spent a long period in Pearl Harbor for overhaul. This kept her out of the fight for 3 months, and she only returned to Ulithi at the end of March 1945. The reason for this overhaul is simple, really. Her power plant had some hidden issues that only showed up in service. Coupled with the usual stresses of keeping up with her charges, and Downes wore herself out. Because of this, her one moment of real excitement was hunting a Japanese submarine. Beyond that, Downes led a quiet life and only earned 4 battle stars. In the end, both of the destroyers were largely worn out by the time the war ended. While their hulls were still practically brand new, and the same could be said for their new systems, the power plants were done. What had been midway through its life cycle had been worn down by the stresses of war. While there was still probably some life left in Cassin, or even Downes, it wasn't enough. The hulls had, as I said, reached the end of their useful upgrade potential. With swarms of Fletchers and newer ships around, Cassin and Downes were every bit as surplus as their surviving sisters. As a result, they would be decommissioned in December of 1945 and sold for scrap in November 1947. Looking back, one can see the argument that the Navy wasted resources on them. They only returned to service well after they were needed, and the steel that went to building their new hulls could have gone to more Fletchers. However, as a morale booster, the idea of these ships coming back from the grave can't be understated. Maybe they weren't the best use of resources from an economical perspective. But from a flipping the bird at Japan perspective, well, you can't really beat them. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.